Do you enjoy hearing the whys and hows behind other people's sewing projects? I love it. Judy Williment-Ross has been on the podcast before and is one of the most prolific, resourceful and creative makers that I know. In this episode, Judy talks us through the ideas and development behind some of her more recent super inspiring projects. She also shares her secrets to creating professional looking garments out of op shop finds and fabric scraps. So stick around a few minutes for that. Welcome to Check Your Thread, the podcast that will help you sew more sustainably. My name's Zoe and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 15 years and I'm the creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge Me Made May. But, like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis and I'm looking at the way that my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. I really hope you'll join me in this journey. Hello, amazing listener. How are you doing today? I'm doing okay. Everyone in our house is starting to get better and hopefully both kids will be back at school this week so I can try and catch up on my podcast making tasks. So how's your sewing going at the moment? I've finished up that backpack that I was making out of corduroy remnants and I've been using it daily ever since. I hope to get a blog post up about it soon and share some pics on Instagram so you can see. I've also busted out a quick t-shirt for myself that I'll post about as my Free Pattern Friday blog post later this week. And I've also made a couple of projects for my daughter because she just keeps on growing. One was upcycling a t-shirt that I bought on one of those last chance rails in a charity shop like 9 years ago. I finally used it to make her a vest top. The other item was a scrappy sweatshirt, both of which have already seen use, which is very satisfying. So here's a sustainability win for the week. So, as I've mentioned previously, my kids changed schools towards the end of last year because their previous school is set to close. I've been trying to make sure that all the uniform items that they wore to that school and all the items that I'd been stockpiling for when they got bigger have been redistributed so they can see more use. Part of that was a pile of white polo shirts. So the larger sized ones without stains, those I was able to give to another family with kids in a different school. But I still had a load that had some stains or permanent pen marks, and I've been putting off dealing with those. But last week, whilst my little boy was home with chickenpox, I decided to start sorting them out. So he selected 3 of them that are in his current size or larger, and we had fun doing some tie-dye experiments, so he can use those as like regular non-school clothes when the weather warms up. Then with some of the others that are too small for him now, I cut the fronts off and I overlocked around the edges, and we'll use those as cloths for sticky hands and faces. I've still got a lot of polo shirts and half polo shirts to use up. As we all know, cotton is a very thirsty plant when it's growing, so it's been good to try and make the most of what already exists in the world. So I guess my sustainability fail related to this is that for the tie-dye, we used regular Dylon hand dye. So to be honest, I don't know how damaging the synthetic chemicals in those dyes are, but they're probably not great. And we inevitably ended up pouring a bunch of them down the drain. If anyone has any information about synthetic dyes for domestic use, please pass it on because I'd love to know more. Right, I want to say this week a massive thanks to these new patrons of the podcast: Yona, Dorothy, Susie, Pam, Evelyn, Nicole, Rosie and H. Plus, I want to say a huge thanks to existing patrons Lindsay and Norma, who oh so kindly upped their amount of support. You are all helping this podcast airflow and I'm super grateful. I literally couldn't cover the costs nor spend the 20 plus hours a week it takes to put this together without the financial contributions from the amazing patrons. So once again, enormous thanks. Right, today's episode then. So Judy was a guest on the podcast a little over a year ago, and that episode received amazing feedback. Lots of listeners got in touch to say that they were deeply fascinated and inspired by Judy's considered way of consuming and making. Plus, the creations that she makes truly belong in some kind of exhibition because they are works of art. And the thing is, Judy just doesn't quit. Since our first conversation, she has continued to produce epic creation after epic creation. So I was desperate to get her back on and get an update on her more recent work. Plus, I really wanted to talk to her to drill down on the idea that garments that are made from scraps needn't look scrappy, and to get her perspective and tips on that. We covered a lot in this conversation, so if you're able, grab yourself a tasty beverage and get comfy. So, until next week, please take care of yourself, your loved ones, and the wider global community that we're all part of. Prepare to look at your scraps in a new light, and enjoy! Boom, we're on. Thank you so much for this, and it being 9:30 in the evening for you. I'm sorry it's so late.
That's fine. I've got this week off work, so I get to sleep in tomorrow morning, so it is all good.
So you were on the podcast before, and I got so much fantastic feedback from your previous appearance, and so many people were really inspired by your thoughtful approach to sewing. And I've noticed that you've been so prolific, creating like incredible creation after incredible creation since that conversation, all of which you've been deploying the materials in your kind of signature, kind of thoughtful and resourceful way. So I really wanted to get you back on the podcast so we can hear more, because you've clearly been busy.
Yeah, well, yes.
Does it feel like you've been busy, or does it feel just like you've just been making at your usual pace?
I think since I did the epic dress, I'm always making something. Before that, I would often have spells where I wouldn't necessarily be making something because I wasn't particularly inspired by anything. And making for the sake of making seems wasteful and pointless and doesn't bring joy, so what's the point? So since the epic dress, I've definitely been just one project after another, because they take so long. I've usually got the next project lined up before I finish one.
Yeah. Do you think that the epic dress kind of almost like unlocked something in your creativity?
Oh, it did. Absolutely. It was not exactly a turning point, but it just opened the floodgates for everything that came afterwards. Just the ideas that had been percolating for such a long time that all came together when I made the epic dress, then sort of spun off in a bunch of different directions. And I came up with new things, sort of building on what I had done with the epic dress, or, with the skirt that I made from the same pattern. I really loved the swish of the skirt of the epic dress, but I wasn't going to make another one the same, because then I'd have two of the same thing. So it had to be different enough to justify being made. So that one got, a different take. And then I was working on the behemoth, the coat, because when I was doing the epic dress, I had smaller scraps, and I was thinking, what can I do with those? And so those two projects in different ways grew out of the epic dress. And then, of course, the scrappy jacket from the even smaller scraps that were too small for patchwork.
Yeah, so where we last left off was just before the scrappy jacket, I think.
Which was your suggestion.
Oh.
That one grew directly out of a suggestion that you made when we last spoke, when I had made just a little bag in that style with the little scraps layered under.
I remember. Yeah, was it a layer of organza or something?
This one was tulle,
right.
But I've got thought with organza, because I've been given organza that is intended for curtains,
right.
And I'm not going to put net curtains in my windows. But I thought, wouldn't it be lovely to layer a whole lot of stuff under that, because you'd get a really different look with the colour of the organza muting all of the colours of what was underneath it.
Yeah, it's like applying a filter in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly like a filter. The tulle is see-through, so it slightly tones it down, but it doesn't add any other colour to it, whereas organza would, as you say, act like a filter, so you get colour as well as muting all the time. So the idea is just keep building and growing.
Amazing. So there was the scrappy jacket, and that was literally threads and little cut-offs from the previous projects.
Yep. It was the bits that were too small for the patchwork that went into the behemoth, that coat. And that jacket, I've worn it so much.
Have you?
It's just the perfect jacket. I'm really, really happy with it.
What pattern did you use
But
as the basis?
I actually used two from Birder magazines.
You've got a lot of Birder magazines, haven't you? It's a happy hunting ground for you.
I have been buying them since I was in my late teens, and I don't get every single issue. In some years I don't get any at all. But they are such good patterns, and I find the fit is really good. So whenever I want a pattern, that's where I start, because I've already got that. That's a resource I already own.
Yeah.
And I have enough understanding of pattern drafting and how to graft parts of two patterns together to be able to create a pattern for what I want. And for that jacket, I used two different patterns. One had, I think, the collar I wanted, and the other one had the princess-themed body panels, which I wanted because I didn't want to have any darts, because the fabric was going to be quite thick.
Yeah. So
I needed all of the shaping to be done with seams rather than darts. So I got the elements I wanted from the two patterns and put them together.
Amazing, amazing. Is that lined, that jacket?
No, it's not lined. So the inside of it is just the backing fabric that the scraps will put on, which is a Bob the Builder duvet cover.
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah, I love it. I just, the kids' old duvet covers. I love having ridiculous insides of things. It just makes me laugh.
It's such a contrast to the outside as well, isn't it?
I know.
And then there was the all tied up dress. Now tell us about that, because that is a wonder in and of itself.
Oh, that was so much fun. I've wanted to make something with ties for such a long time, but all of the things that you see on Pinterest and Instagram, they're all incorporating the points of the ties. A lot of the time when I'm using pre-loved materials, usually clothing, I use it as fabric. I don't necessarily incorporate the features of the garment. I most certainly do with pockets on men's trousers. I love the pockets. But a lot of the time I'm only using the fabric, and ties come in such beautiful fabrics. And when you open up a tie and press it flat, there's quite a bit of fabric there. So for years I was trying to figure out what I could do that would work well with not a lot of fabric. And I'd always thought I was going to do some sort of a patchwork, but I just couldn't quite find the right idea. And then looking at Pinterest or somewhere for quilting patterns and finding patchwork patterns, and I found the one that I ended up using, and it was just that light bulb moment of that's the perfect one, because it's one shape. I can just cut out as many rectangles as I can out of each tie and then group them together, and I need 4 for each of the cross shapes. And then if I have leftovers, I'll group them in like colours and put them together. But as long as I had a bit of a contrast between lights and darks, I could put them anywhere. So it worked really, really well. I didn't have to have a whole lot of any one thing. And once that sort of light bulb moment happened, it was quite straightforward. And coming up with an idea for the dress was, what do I like? I like dresses that wrap, and I liked the idea of a bodice that had darts that went off to the side, so there was a big unbroken sort of area in the front rather than having darts that went vertically from bust to waist. And again, that was a Birder magazine. Came up with the idea of using slightly smaller rectangles for the bodice of the dress, made that first, and then just cut everything else into the slightly bigger rectangles, and then just made patchwork until I ran out of rectangles, and that was the skirt. And I love it. Oh, and then of course I put all of the labels of the ties as a panel on the back edge, just as a way of, I guess, honouring where all of the materials came from.
Cool. Okay. So how many ties went into that?
It was 51.
51! Wow. How heavy is it?
It's not particularly heavy. I think because it's not lined apart from the bodice, and the ties are pretty lightweight fabrics.
Amazing. I bet that gets a lot of compliments, isn't it?
It does. That's the one when I'm walking through the campus, I get unsolicited compliments, which is always really lovely.
They're better than the solicited ones, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Tell me I look good.
Absolutely. Oh, God, I could never say that to anybody.
Do people realise it's ties, or do you have to explain that to them, or when they get closer they realise?
I think they figure it out quite easily because tie fabrics are quite distinctive.
Right. I really love that you use the ties because you've used like men's suits and you've used traditional men's like workwear, button-up shirts, and the ties, that kind of just rounds it all off.
It felt like a natural progression.
Absolutely. When I saw that, I was like, of course that's where she went next. Of course it is. But then you took a different angle and you surprised us all by making a coat for your good friend out of a blanket. No one saw that coming.
Yeah, well, I'd actually made one for myself a few years ago, and you sort of see them on the internet and you think, oh, they're lovely. And I made one out of a coat that came from my childhood home, and I had big capey sleeves on it. So I hadn't actually worn it in a while. And then when I was talking to Rhonda, she mentioned that she'd always wanted one since she was a child. She had wanted a coat made out of a blanket. And she can sew. She's made some beautiful quilts, but she doesn't make clothes. And she doesn't make things for herself. So I decided that had to change and told her to get a blanket and we were going to make her a coat. And she loves it and she wears it all the time.
Oh, amazing. What considerations do you have when you're reusing a blanket? Like, it's not a project that I've done before.
That was one that quite a lot of thought went into. Partly, is it okay to cut up a usable blanket? Because this is a resource that potentially could be useful to somebody. And what makes me sort of feel okay about that is that they aren't used a lot. Mostly people use duvets. So that's why there are blankets around. Other than that, people are going for things like acrylic blankets that you can put in the washing machine more easily and that kind of thing. So first of all, it's like, is it okay to cut up a blanket? And decided, yes, it's okay to cut up a blanket. And then it was a case of getting the coat pattern onto the blanket in the most efficient way so that we used the whole blanket and there was very little left over. And I have plans, because of course I do, for the little leftover bits, which will take me a long time. But I cross-stitch Christmas ornaments onto the little leftover bits of blanket and they just look fantastic as Christmas ornaments. But then we had a bit of an interesting time with Rhonda's blanket because it was a little bit distorted where it had been washed and some of it had sort of shrunk and some of it sort of hadn't. So we completely underlined it with a sheet, which I had used to make a toile, and this was a fitted sheet that was completely worn out in the middle. But of course all the outside of the sheet is perfectly good fabric, so that's what
I have a few of those. Yeah,
I know, they're absolutely perfect for things like toiles and underlinings and all those support structures that you don't see. And once the blanket had been stitched to the sheet, then very carefully pressed, flattened out beautifully and sewed up beautifully into a coat.
Amazing. Oh, that must be so nice to see her wear it.
Yeah, it is. Well, it makes her so happy because it's something she's wanted for such a long time, and I don't think she thought she was ever going to get one. Yeah, so now she's got her blanket coat.
Yeah. And then your daughter wanted one.
Yeah, she took one look at Rhonda's and basically immediately got on the internet and found herself a blanket. And she loves hers and she wears it all the time.
And it's quite funny. She's just moved up to Wellington and got her dream job up there. And she puts her coat on a hanger on the coat rack at work. And one of the people at her work, I think it was the receptionist, thought that My Mum Made It was a brand, because I thought it would be funny to make a little label for the inside of it that said My Mum Made It. So I did. And apparently I think the receptionist thought that was a brand. So that was great.
Oh, amazing. I can imagine the receptionist in their lunch break just like typing in like, My mum made it, seeing if they could find a neon.
Yeah, no, sorry.
It is a brand. It's a very exclusive brand
is.
with 3 customers.
Oh, yeah. She has now requested that everything I make for her, I have to put a label in it that says My Mum Made It.
Yeah, but you're hand stitching those labels, aren't you? I think you need to get some printed.
I'm about to, because I'm about to make her 4 shirts.
Then that's not the end of the blanket coat situation, is it? Because you revisited your own, no?
Yeah, I took the cape sleeves off because once I started using a backpack rather than a handbag for work, the cape sleeves just weren't working. So I took them off and cut conventional sleeves out of them and put them back on. And it works absolutely brilliantly, and I wear it all the time.
Amazing.
But yeah, once I saw Rhonda and Georgia wearing their blanket coats, I wanted my blanket coat back again.
Well, that's so good that it's good that you kept it.
Yeah.
B, that you found the motivation to go back in and make it work for you.
Well, I don't mind spending the time to redo something that isn't working, because I'm going to spend a lot more time wearing it now than I did altering it.
Yeah, I think sometimes people may want to go and rework something, but sometimes there's almost like a paralysis due to kind of lack of knowing how to approach something, isn't there? Do you find that it's you have to think about something for a while till the idea of how to improve it occurs, or is it quite a quick thing for you?
It depends what the problem is. Generally, I start by thinking about where I want to end up. If I've got something that's not working, there'll be a reason why it's not working. So I've got to figure out what it is that's the problem, what the end goal is. In this case, it was I need sleeves because the cape sleeves aren't working with the backpack. So the goal or the end result was I need sleeves. So that was pretty straightforward. The challenging bit was actually cutting sleeves out of the cape, because obviously I had to put seams in them because I couldn't cut a full sleeve out of what I had. The good thing was that the original one was a jacket and I had put the capes into princess seams. So I already had a jacket with armholes, so it was quite straightforward to do that. But cutting the sleeves, the only way to do that was have a sleeve pattern and just play around with it on the cape sections until I figured out where I could put the seams that I was happy with, and away I went. But with everything else, I start thinking with the end in mind. What do I need from this thing? What's going to make it work for me? And then I have to think about what to do to get from where it is now to where I want it to be.
That's a really good tip. Yeah, think about what's going to work and work backwards.
Yeah.
How can I create that rather than like, what can I do with this?
Yeah.
Okay. So then there's the waistcoat.
Yeah, I was quite proud of that though too. Yeah.
Yes, genius. I love it. I love that they've all got their own hashtag as well, because you share so much about the process and you really let people in to both the practical process and the kind of thought process. And I love that you share when things have gone a bit wrong as well, so you can really get involved and see that it's not just like ta-da,
I've always really enjoyed watching people's process, particularly when it's a creative process rather than here's the pattern I bought, here's the fabric I bought, here's the garment I made. That's not, to me, as interesting as somebody who's taken something quite unusual and turned it into something quite conventional looking, or they've just dreamed up something and made a pattern and created the garment. I really enjoy watching the process, so that's what got me going on sharing so much of my own process. And because I tend to do quite unusual things, and people are really interested. That started when I was doing the epic dress. I was sharing it on Instagram as a visual diary for myself so that I had a record of it. And people kept saying, "Oh, I love it every time this pops up in my feed," which made me realise that people really do like to see how I made the decisions on things and what techniques I'm using, what materials I'm using, why I'm doing what I'm doing in a particular place. And I have some really good conversations with people about, the why and the how as much as the end result.
That must be really, really nice to know that
really,
you are
really rewarding.
Inspiring people as well to maybe have a go themselves.
Oh, here's hoping. It's so much fun. And it's very low risk.
Yeah. So the waistcoat, that was all the little hexes, is that right?
Yes. This was little bits left over from the tie dress, because obviously I was cutting a very specific shape of rectangle out of the tie, so there was always going to be leftover. And I was never going to let that go to waste because me.
You.
My first thought was hexes, and I will gather up the tiny bits and they will be layered under something, because can you just imagine what that would look like? All those little bits of silk under organza or tulle or something will be amazing. I haven't quite decided what I'm going to make out of it yet, but that's being processed at the moment. We're thinking about that one. So I'd always intended to make something out of the little leftover bits, and I don't know quite with the idea of a vest, but I just love the idea of it, because I made one about a year and a half ago, I think, from men's trousers, obviously. But it was made from a pattern which I had got online from a drafting manual from 1895.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that was really fun. And I just loved the shape of it, and I'd always wanted to make another one. So I thought, wouldn't that be fabulous in all of these little bits of tie? Because that effect of the patchwork would work really well in quite a small garment. So I started with that idea and just made a whole bunch of them. And then I'd always thought if I was going to make a vest, I was going to quilt it. And I had thought of the idea of using the tie inners, the kind of felty padding that goes in a tie, as the batting, because I wanted to use it. I'd taken apart all these ties, and I don't want to throw out half of it, because that absolutely defeats the purpose of reusing them and upcycling them if you throw away half of it.
Yeah.
So I had always thought it would make good batting for a finish quilt project. So for this vest, it was absolutely ideal. So I sort of very carefully cut strips of it to the right size and, basted them all together. And then the backing of the quilt sandwich was a leftover duvet cover from another project. And at some point, reasonably early on, I think I realised that everything going into this project was waste. And when I make the patchwork, I use junk mail and invoices for the papers for my hexagons.
Oh, cool.
And my basting thread is all the thread from the things that I've upcycled, that are, when you get a chain stitch, you pull one end of it and the whole thing comes out, or the overlocking threads. I keep all of those and I use them for basting, and they're also really good for mending, because they're often really good colours for odd shades of greys and things like that. So I wouldn't necessarily trust it for construction, but it's brilliant for basting, and because it's waste, I'm quite happy to use it for basting. And then when I've got tiny little bits that come out of the hexie, it's like, well, I'm sorry, but that's going in the bin now, but it's been used about 4 times. So yeah, I just kind of realised that everything in this waistcoat was waste. The zip has been recycled from summer as well.
I really feel you need to have an exhibition, honestly.
I had a few people say, like, when I was making the epic dress and when it was finished, quite a lot of people said, oh, that should be in a museum. And
no, I don't think it should be in a museum permanently, but I do think there should be an exhibition that maybe, like, you know, fashion students or kind of keen makers or, you know, people who are resourceful. And obviously it can't be forever because that's half your wardrobe. But I think that...
I have nothing to wear.
I know. This is what I'm saying. It's a temporary thing. Maybe like in the height of summer or something, where some of these garments you're not wearing.
One of the reasons I put the labels and things is because of the comments about the museums when I was making the epic dress. I thought, that would be funny. And so I thought, well, I'll put my name and date in it. And, you know, the family joke is that future curators will thank me when this thing is in a museum in 100 years.
They will. They will. Absolutely.
Oh, they can Google me on whatever the Wayback Machine is and find my Instagram back in the archives. Yeah.
And then, because it is warming up over there now, isn't it? You've been turning your attentions to using linens.
Yes.
And you created a couple of stunning garments, including one that you just dropped today, which blew my mind when I checked Instagram first thing this morning.
I wondered if you'd see that before we talked.
Yeah.
The one I did today, it was like, oh my God, I made something in a day. I just don't do that.
So you actually made it in a day as well?
I made it in a day. I made it today.
That must have been like, for your projects that normally take literally months, that must have been I don't even know who I am.
I know, absolutely. It's just not how I do things. But the longest part of that one was unpicking the border around it, because it had this lovely crocheted border that I didn't want to use in this one. And it was sewn on really, really well, really tiny, really invisible stitches. And it took me literally hours. It took the entire morning to get it off. And then actually making this wee jacket took hardly any time at all. And it's just lovely. And now I think the weather's supposed to turn to custard, so I probably won't get to wear it for a while.
It's so pretty. So you use the bog coat, the traditional kind of almost like ground zero waist pattern, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't know how long that's been around for, but is it thousands?
I think it is, isn't it?
It's a really, really long time that the first examples of it have been around. And that was the light bulb moment last night, because I kept trying to think of ways to turn it into a shirt or a top or something to wear in summer, because it's this beautiful lightweight linen. And I just wasn't coming up with anything that wasn't going to chop straight through some of the pretty embroidery. Right. I had an idea yesterday, and I was folding it this way and that and sort of looking at pattern pieces on it, and like, no, that's not going to work. And I can't even remember what yesterday's idea was now, just that it wasn't going to work. And I just decided, okay, I'm going to head off to Pinterest and do a bit of a search on, you know, upcycled tablecloths, because you hit something and you just keep scrolling down and all these new ideas pop up, and somewhere is the thing that sparks the idea. And then I got onto zero waste patterns, and the bog coat idea popped up, and it's like, oh, that's it. But also it wasn't just the standard bog coat, it was a slight variation on it, so it's exactly the same end result, but it's cut slightly differently, so that instead of having like a horizontal seam on each front where the sleeve joins and a solid back, that seam goes over to the back so that you have just a solid front. And what that meant was that I had the border of my tablecloth intact. So I decided not to cut the neck shaping out of it and just do a little bit of a centre back seam.
It's so pretty. What as well I think is so interesting, it's like that the term bog coat, you think of kind of like, I think of kind of like prehistoric people in a mud hut somewhere in terrible weather.
Exactly.
Whereas like the thing that you have made is the most delicate, beautiful thing. It's like it could not be more different from the term bog coat.
I think I'm going to have to call it something other than that. But, I mean, that's what it is. It was a bog coat pattern because it was perfect. It was 2 cuts, one little bit of insertion ladder stuff to make my centre back seam just because I felt like it. And I thought because I was joining 2 finished edges, that would be a nice way of joining them.
Absolutely.
And then just one seam. So it was really quick.
Yeah. It's probably the thing that took about 3,000 times more to plan than it took to do.
It did. It really did. Because I just was not coming up with an answer that wasn't going to diminish the tablecloth. And it was so lovely. I mean, it's machine embroidered. It's not somebody's precious family heirloom. But it is an absolutely beautiful fabric, and it deserved better than to be, in the filler bag for $2 bin at the op shop, which is where it was.
Do you think that zero waste patterns might be an area that you might explore a bit more going forward?
It's something I've been interested in for a long time. This is the first one I've ever done. And part of the reason for not doing zero waste construction is because a lot of what I've seen are the looser, boxy styles, which aren't sort of my preference. But there are patterns that I look at and I'm quite intrigued by. There's a pair of spiral trousers, which I think is Holly McQuillan. I'm not 100% sure on that one. And I'm absolutely intrigued by that. But I want to have a go at that because I absolutely love the idea of zero waste if I've got a piece of virgin untouched fabric.
Yeah, and I suppose because a lot of what you create, you're using fabric that's been harvested from existing garments, isn't it? So you don't have that big kind of meterage. But I can imagine because of the kind of the creative kind of investigative brain that you've got, I can imagine you really enjoying the challenge of a zero waste pattern and seeing how it comes together. I can imagine that that's something that would appeal to you.
It's long been on the list of things I'd like to have a go at, to actually create a zero waste pattern for myself, for a shape that I would like to wear. But the list of things I want to do is incredibly long.
Absolutely. So to kind of move on slightly, because another very interesting project that you've kind of been working on alongside all these other things is creating an amazing professional wardrobe for your daughter. Congratulations to Georgia for getting the job of her dreams. Amazing. You must be so, so proud. But I'd love to hear about the wardrobe that you've created, how you sourced the materials, kind of what considerations you had in mind for creating the things that she needs for her new position.
Well, first of all, just sort of for background, she's working as a law clerk. She's going to be admitted to the bar in December and she's going to be a lawyer. So obviously that meant a very specific wardrobe.
And I know you like a constraint, so...
I find a challenge quite rewarding, I think. It's like, okay, these are my limitations. What can I do within those limitations? I think it's easier than having too much scope sometimes. So she doesn't have to be too dressed up in the office, but when she starts going to court, then yes, she will have to look very particular. And of course, having been a student for the previous 5.5 years, she wore sweatpants and hoodies and jeans and had a couple of nice things for going out, and she did not have anything at all that was suitable for work. So we had a little bit of time, and so we had a really good talk about what she would like as a work wardrobe. She also didn't know what the kind of vibe of the office was going to be, if it was going to be all of the women wore dresses, or if it was really casual unless they were going to court, or whether it was very sort of corporate looking. So she decided that shirts, trousers, blazers would be her work uniform, and things that she could start with and then she could add to her wardrobe as time went on and she was able to work out what she needed. I'd been given trousers for upcycling, and she and I were up in the roof, which is where I store all my fabric, looking for something, and came across these things, and we looked through them because I thought, maybe there's something there that I could recut for you. And there was one pair of these olive green trousers that she really liked. So that was the first pair, I think, that we altered for. Well, I altered for her. So they were men's ones, and she tried them on, and the big thing was they fit her around the hips, and that was all that they needed to do, because men's trousers have that seam up through the centre back seam and then up through the waistband, so that if they fit at the hip, you can take that in enough that they would work perfectly fine at the waist, and then we tapered the legs to suit her preference and hem them.
Perfect.
And that was it. And she loved them, and they worked really well. So we thought, okay, that's going to save so much time if we can buy and alter second-hand trousers for you, because men's trousers are made of much nicer fabrics than women's ones are. And just plain trousers in nice fabrics would be fantastic. So I would go off op shopping armed with her measurements, and this is the key. I had all of her measurements in a memo on my phone.
Top tip.
Yeah. If you're sewing for someone else, take their measurements with you.
And a tape measure.
Yeah, and a tape measure. And the other measurement that was critical was the hem circumference of the shirt pattern that fit her. Because the plan had also been, apart from trousers, to try and find men's shirts to alter. And in the end, I only managed to find one that I altered, because I got a couple that I thought might work, but that was before I took the measurement of the hem with me. And they were just that little tiny bit too narrow, so I couldn't redo them. Anyway, for the trousers, once I sort of nailed down what she needed, and she wanted just classic colours, it was just a matter of finding them, and they are there to be found. She wanted, black, grey, navy, and I think I had one other pair that I had found already that were a sort of a taupey colour, I think, all wool, and they all got the same treatment, and some were better than others depending on whether they were a little bit bigger or just sort of a perfect fit, but they cost so little that it was well worth all of the time it took to alter everything, because it gave her a really good starting wardrobe so that she was going to have enough clothes for quite some time, and then the pressure's off to build up the wardrobe. So for shirts, I made several. She actually bought new fabric for that, which was a bit of a novelty.
You're like, what do I do with this?
I know. It's like, oh, new fabric? We do that? And then there was one that I altered, which was really easy. It was a man's one, so I just recut it using the pattern that I had, just took out the sleeves and recut the body using the pattern, but left the front bands and collar on, and then sort of put the sleeves back in. I thought that was a whole lot quicker than making it.
Absolutely, because it's not a quick project, is it?
I'd rather have done that for all of them, yeah. And blazers, again, they were sourced based on what she'd asked for, and it was black, grey, navy, and I think all of them there were 4, and all had some modification, but one of them was literally just snipping the buttons off the cuffs, because it didn't have cuffs, it just had these buttons on, and she thought they looked weird, so I cut those off. One needed the sleeves moved in, 2 of them needed the centre backs shaped a bit, so it had a bit more feminine shape to them, and I can't remember what I did to the other one. Oh, I just knocked the notch off a lapel because it was peaked and she didn't like it, so just trimmed that down.
Amazing.
But yeah, all of these things had been found secondhand and just modified so that they worked for what she wanted. So when she went off to her new job, she had a substantial wardrobe, and now she's been working there for a couple of months. She wears everything, some things more than others. She doesn't wear the blazers all the time. She leaves them for work. so that when she's got to sort of do a runner to the court to drop papers off or something, she can wear a blazer.
Yeah, that must be so satisfying for you to know that all that work, because you make it sound like I just did this, I just did that, but that is a lot of work, and to even
It was a lot of work. It took a lot of time.
Those kind of garments aren't always made, especially the jackets aren't always made for you to get in and then make it look like you had never got in, and so that in itself is a lot of puzzling, isn't it? Like, how can I get in to do what I need to do without creating then a lot more work for myself?
Yeah. Usually the way into a jacket is the same. You go in a sleeve, but sometimes things are like tacked so that linings stay put, and you've got to undo the tacking because otherwise you just can't pull out the bit you need to work on. And I would always try and not undo any more than I could help, and then I would regret it. And I think if I'd just given myself a bigger hole, this would be so much easier, and it's not that hard to sew up the hole. So there's another tip. Give yourself plenty of working room, because it is such a pain trying to work through a tiny little hole in a sleeve.
Sure. Okay, that is a great tip. Brilliant. Something that I think that your work does so brilliantly is it shows that you can sew projects that are made from upcycled resources or scraps or leftovers. They do not need to look quote unquote scrappy, so not that there is anything wrong with a scrappy aesthetic. Like, that can be super fun and it really suits some people. In fact, I'm wearing my dungarees that are made from scraps of denim.
Oh, I love those ones.
And I think most people would probably say they're quite scrappy, and I'm fine with that. But the kind of scrappy aesthetic, it doesn't really necessarily suit everyone, and it doesn't necessarily suit every situation either, does it? And I think that maybe I wonder if some people are put off creating things from scraps because they think that it is going to result in a look that maybe isn't very representative for them, Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I've thought about this one quite a lot because, I abandoned a project that I was going to work on this week, which was using shirts. I've got a whole pile of bits of shirt left over from previous things. And I was going to make a skirt out of it, and I'm still going to make that skirt, although I'm now going to make it out of something else, and I'm possibly going to put it off till winter, because when I got the bits of shirt out to look at, they just did not jibe, and I can't quite put my finger on what it is, but it's like, no, they don't go together. And I think they were just too different, and what I had in mind was going to look jarring, I think. So I just ditched that idea, and I'll come back to the shirt idea in a different way. But it really got me thinking about why that particular idea wasn't going to work, because it was going to look scrappy, which never bothers me. I mean... I seem to be the queen of scraps.
You say that, but I can imagine everything that you make. I can completely imagine it being worn in a pretty, maybe not like a lawyer's office, but a professional situation, if you wanted to, if you chose to,
I think a lot of the reason that works is because I have a reasonably limited palette of materials for each project. So the epic dress is pretty exuberant because it's got all kinds of fabrics, very random shapes, and all colours of thread that I had, and all sorts of bits and pieces. But the silhouette of the dress is quite simple. It's quite a structured shape. It's quite an elegant shape. So the design of the dress isn't fighting with the surface embellishment of it. And the same applies for a lot of my things. The shapes of the garments are relatively simple, or the silhouettes are fairly simple. So you've not got a really fussy design fighting with a really busy fabrication. And with the tie dress, it's just a giant rectangle and a very basic bodice. So the impact is all from the patchwork. And the vest is a very simple shape as well. But in each of those cases, the materials used are fairly limited. So the tie dress is obviously all ties. They're all different, but there is that unifying look of what tie fabric looks like. And for the vest, obviously, it's the tie fabric, so it's the same thing. And the shapes of the patchwork are very uniform. So there's a pleasing symmetry, I guess, to what the surface looks like. And the quilting on the waistcoat is just a really basic sort of swirly design. Gives it a lot of texture, but it doesn't interfere with anything else.
Sure. So it's like choosing elements that aren't competing for your attention.
Yeah. Although I do like the layered effect, with the epic dress, the layering of the colours of stitching over the top of the fabrics kind of softened some of the effect of it, because you'd see the stitching where it was bright and you'd see the fabric where the stitching was dark and the fabric was light. So it blurred it, and it didn't exactly make it look like a camouflage, but it softened the edges of where the patches were.
Yeah. I know what you mean. I'm thinking of, I don't know if you saw it, but I made a kind of quilted jacket that was a patchwork, a kind of almost crazy patchwork of denim.
Yeah.
The patchwork was quite bold. I mean, it was a consistent colour palette, but I think then when I just did the quilting and that really traditional kind of, it wasn't a diamond, it was just like a square, that almost brought like a uniformity to it. Or just an extra dimension that kind of knocked back the patchwork in and of itself,
I followed that project with great interest. It was absolutely fabulous. I love that jacket, and I've decided I need one that length now too.
It's actually been really useful. That length it's been good, because there was definitely a gap in my wardrobe in that I had some kind of hip length jackets.
Yeah. Now I've got the behemoth, which is fabulous, and I've got shorter jackets, but I want something that is not as heavy as the behemoth, but is longer than my shorter ones. So, watch this space.
It's happening.
So,
it's in the works.
Thanks for that. But no, I remember when you were making that one, just thinking that when you put the quilting on, it kind of brought everything together, I think.
Yeah. I'm so desperate to get to a
really
bit of quilting.
Kind of unified it.
Yeah. So maybe that's an element as well. Maybe it's a case of, so maybe that one way to make a kind of more realised garment and less scrappy is almost to do another thing, rather than scale it back and just let this do its thing. Maybe there's like an extra technique or an extra, I don't know, like, as you say, like creating a
Something
shape
that goes over the whole thing.
Yeah. Or like you were saying with the shapes that you use, with the basic garment shapes. Often your garments, they're not boxy. They're quite fitted, aren't they? They're quite if not figure hugging, then figure referencing. And I wonder if those shapes that are suitable for a professional environment possibly means that you have almost more leeway with the fabrication, as you say.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I think if I was making something that was more frivolous in like garment design, then it would just be too over the top if it had all this other stuff going on as well. So I think the simpler silhouettes that I like to wear really lend themselves to these quite busy surface fabrications.
Yeah. And what you were saying as well about choosing the kind of construction method that's going to work better for your overall project. Like, for example, choosing the princess seams when it was a garment that you wanted to avoid bulk. And then when you were making the all tied up dress, using something that had darts that came from a very specific angle. So you were keeping the overall, almost like a canvas, weren't you, on the bodice, so that the patchwork could really sing. You didn't want to break it up too much with that, like a princess seam wouldn't have worked, would it?
No, I didn't. With that one, I didn't want to cut through any more of the patchwork than I could help, because it would look jarring if you had these lines through it. So a dart was still going to break it up, but I felt that where I put the dart...
Yeah, it was the least intrusive.
Yeah, definitely. If I'd had vertical darts, then they would have been really obvious. But it's that sort of the consideration for what is going to work the best in terms of the visual as well as the fit.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's a compromise.
Yeah, for sure. But I also really love the way that, you clearly focus on getting a really good fit first. Like, they're obviously patterns you've either used before or you've trialled in advance. This is not your first rodeo with that pattern, which is really when you don't want it to be, is it? When you've put all this effort in.
Sometimes it is because...
Oh, Judy.
Yep. The epic dress that I spent a year on, I did not twirl before I made it.
You're joking!
Nope.
I'm so glad I'm sitting down. I would have fallen
This
over.
is why I love Burda magazines. I know that I can measure myself and I can refer to their size chart and I can take a look at the garment and I can flat measure the garment and I can make it and it'll be fine. I've been sewing with them for long time.
So it's because you already knew their blocks and their size charts well. You wouldn't have gone for like a brand new one from a different pattern company that you'd never touched before.
Oh God, no. But having said that, that I didn't twirl it, I did put big seam allowances on it and I did pin it together before I did all of the stitching. So I did check.
You did like a fit check before you went.
I checked it was going to work before I did all of the surface stitching. And I did put big seam allowances on it just in case. But I didn't do a twirl first.
Wow. I don't even know if I can release that. That's too mind-blowing. People will be like...
Sorry.
They'll be crashing their cars. Okay, final question. Did you make the cover for your overlocker with the quote from your daughter?
Yes. It's on the list of things I have to do because it's hilarious. But I've always had so many other things to do. And it's like, I really need to do that because my overlocker is still sitting there without a cover. And it wouldn't take that long.
Well, it doesn't sound like it has a chance to gather dust. It sounds like it's in constant use.
Like my sewing machine hasn't had a cover on for years because it's never put away. But no, I do need to do that because it's too good not to.
Remind me of the quote?
Overlocking. It's like sewing, but faster and with knives.
Amazing. It has to happen. Please.
It does.
So, Judy, where can people find you and see all these incredible projects that we've been talking about?
I was going to say mostly on Instagram, but basically only on Instagram. So I'm Judy Williment-Ross on Instagram. And that's where I put all the process, all the thoughts behind what I'm doing, and then the end result. And some days like today, it was the end result because the process was so short.
Thank you so much for your time once again. Let's do this in another 6 months to a year when you've made another load of amazing garments and I need to hear all about those.
Oh, I don't know what I'll do by then, but thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure to chat.
Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and are left feeling inspired. For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palm Skin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!